This section of notes, we're going to pick up where we left off with rural to urban migration. Then we're going to look at where most of the cities are, the different types of major cities in the world, and where they're located globally. Then we're going to look at the cities specifically, look at their functions, look at their economic base, and then even get into a little bit of the urban influence zones and how that influenced cities and their makeup. And then finally, we're going to touch on John Borchert's Epochs and the different types of transportation methods that developed inside of cities. Number 2, rural to urban migration and urban growth. Urbanization accelerated in the 1800s in Europe and North America. Urbanization in the United States in 1800 was about 5%, meaning 5% of the population lived in cities. In 1920, it was 50%. And that percentage has grown even more in today's world. In more recent years, this has increased in less developed regions of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. This means the percentage of people in poor countries living in cities has risen from 25% in 1950 to 50% in 2010. So in the poorer areas, less people are living in the rural countryside and more people are living in cities, which should mean that conditions are better, but in a lot of cases, it's not. The amount of urban growth differs from continent to continent and region to region, but nearly all countries have two things in common. Number 1, their proportion of their people living in cities is rising, and number 2, the cities themselves are large and growing. Number 3, world cities and megacities. During the second half of the 20th century, manufacturing cities stopped growing, with many factories relocating outside cities or closing their doors as economies adjusted to the post-industrial world and labor for the manufacturing centers shifted to other areas of the world. New transportation systems allowed workers to live farther off and not next to the factories or their jobs. First aspect of this we want to look at is world cities, also known as global cities. These are located all over the globe, but the 3 largest world cities and the prime examples of world cities are London, England, New York, United States, and Tokyo, Japan. These all have important stock exchanges and major concentrations of business services. All 3 of these have a polarized social structure with large numbers of wealthy. These are also home to international business centers. It's hard to find a visual of this, but this map here shows you business activity. Shows you the leader being New York, but you've also got Tokyo, the human capital, kind of as almost your cultural aspect. Tokyo, New York. Your information exchange, New York, a couple of different sections of New York. Your cultural experiences, London, 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 New York. Your political exchange, we've got New York. But your main thing that makes it a world cities is you have international business centers focused here. That makes it a world city or a global city. Then we move on to mega cities. These are cities that have over 10 million people in them. There's 19 metropolises that had more than 10 million people in 2010. Now we have even more. This map here is going to show you 16 of those. Presently, there's 24 megacities in the world. But you could kind of get a visual of where they are. Shanghai, leading the world at 24 million. And then goes all the way down to Seoul, South Korea, at almost 11 million. But you could locate the major mega cities on this map here. These are the ones that are red, over 10 million. You see there's some in North America, There's several in South America. Then you also have a lot in East Asia and a lot in South Asia, and then even one in Indonesia. And then we have a lot of growing centers in other parts of the world. But you can kind of see the location of these huge cities. Many of these megacities are located in less developed countries, and they have overpopulated housing centers. The richest people in these less developed megacities in the world live in these cities, and they live virtually next door to the poorest people. Then we move on to functions of cities. Cities usually provide services for themselves and for others outside their city limits. Types of cities. Some cities are transportation centers, where major routes converge, such as roads, railroads, sea traffic, and air transportation. Others are special functioning cities engaged in mining, manufacturing, or recreation. Another type of city is a multifunctional city. They do a number of activities based on the needs of the population. A common property of all settlements is centrality, so that cities become central places that provide goods and services for the surrounding area. Economic base of a city. Economists and geographers often compare cities by function by creating a base ratio, or a ratio between workers employed in the basic sector, which are jobs that are export-oriented and bring into the city, and then compares that with those employed in the non-basic sector or the service industry. Usually, the larger the city, the more people you will have in the non-basic sector, because most cities and most places in the world are becoming developed, and we know they need the tertiary and quaternary economic activities to be more developed. Eventually, a multiplier effect takes hold in which new basic sector employment is accompanied by a large share of non-basic workers, decreasing the ratio of basic sector workers to non-basic sector workers. An example of this: if a new industry locates to a city that produced goods for people outside the city, such as automobiles, the new workers need services from non-basic workers, such as grocery store clerks, gasoline attendants, doctors and lawyers, etc. As a result, more non-basic jobs are created because of the basic sector job that was put there in the first place. The urban influence zones. These are areas outside the city that are affected by the city. As the distance away from the city increases, its influences on the surrounding countryside decrease. The larger the city is, the larger the sphere of influence outside its borders grow. A good example of this, and kind of reviewing where we've came from so far, is the gravity model. The simplest form of the gravity model looks at the interaction between two towns. This suggests that two cities located close together would attract more people than two cities located farther apart. This model is used to predict the flows of human activity between places. It has been criticized for its inability to take into account the evolution of patterns because it uses a perfect example. In other ways, it doesn't take into account physical features, doesn't take into account transportation systems. It's just the idea that the closer two cities are, the more interaction they'll have. The closer a big city is than a town is from a village, the people in the village are more likely to be attracted to the city, despite the city being farther away. And then the changing city. As cities grow older, they inevitably change, creating different mixes of employment opportunities and demographic characteristics. In 1967, John Borchert recognized 4 stages in the evolution of the American metropolis. The first occurred from 1790 to 1830. That was the sail wagon epoch. Trade consisted of sea with ships and land with wagons. Then we moved on to the Iron Horse epoch, 1830 to 1870. Railroad technology changed the nature of trade and employment. Then 3, the Steel Rail epoch, 1870 to 1920. The steel industry transformed urban America and job opportunities. Then number 4, Auto Air Amenity epoch, 1920s to 1960s, when the internal combustion engine dominated lifestyles. Today, many could add an epoch initiated by computer technology and call it the high technology epoch. But John Borchert only came up with 4.